The 8-hour paralysis, how bureaucracy nearly lost D-Day. A telephone call pierced the silence at the headquarters of the 21st Panzer Division shortly after 3 in the morning on the 6th of June, 1944, near the town of Caen. British airborne troops were descending from the night sky, landing east of the Orne River according to the urgent report. When the duty officer attempted to contact General Major Edgar Feuchtinger, he discovered the division's commanding officer was absent from his post. Instead of being with his troops, Feuchtinger had traveled 60 miles away to spend time with his mistress in Paris, enjoying the peaceful comforts of the occupied French capital. As paratroopers fell through the darkness over the Normandy countryside, as artillery shells from the initial bombardment began shaking the earth, Feuchtinger remained far removed from his responsibilities and his command. This wasn't simply a mistake in judgment or a momentary lapse of duty. What he had done amounted to an abandonment of the soldiers under his command, men who would spend the coming hours desperately awaiting orders that would arrive far too late to make a difference. The armored division he commanded consisted of 127 tanks and 16,000 men, making it a formidable force. Within a 30-mile radius of the Normandy coastline, this was the only German armored division available to respond, yet its commander had chosen to be 60 miles distant in Paris. Without waiting for Feuchtinger's return, the division's chief of staff took matters into his own hands and made an immediate tactical decision. He issued orders for an attack to be launched against the British paratroopers who had landed east of the Orne River. German tanks were engaging elements of the British 6th Airborne Division within 90 minutes of the initial paratrooper drop, demonstrating the division's ability to respond quickly when leadership was present. However, these engagements were merely reconnaissance operations against inland paratroop positions. The attacks were limited in scope and, more critically, directed away from where they were actually needed. The staff officers at division headquarters lacked the authority to commit their full armored strength to attacking the beaches where the primary invasion force was coming ashore. 3 hours after the first alert, just as dawn was beginning to break, headquarters received a second urgent telephone call. The coast west of Caen was being hammered by massive naval bombardment from Allied warships. The experienced staff officers manning the division headquarters immediately understood the implications of this development. What they were witnessing wasn't a diversionary raid or a limited operation. The long-anticipated Allied invasion of France had finally begun. They immediately contacted 7th Army headquarters to request permission to disengage from the fight against the paratroopers and redirect their main force toward the beaches under assault. If they moved immediately, their primary armored force could reach those invasion beaches within 2 hours' time, allowing them to strike the Allied troops while they were still vulnerable and struggling to get off their landing craft. The response from higher command arrived almost instantly, and it was devastating. The answer was negative. No panzer movements were authorized without explicit permission from the Führer's headquarters in Bavaria. The greatest amphibious invasion in human history had commenced, and Germany's nearest armored division was already committed to fighting in the wrong location, while its commanding officer remained absent from the battlefield. The positioning of the 21st Panzer Division near Caen had been a deliberate strategic choice, specifically intended to enable a rapid response to any invasion attempt in this sector. Field Marshal Rommel had insisted on maintaining at least one armored division close to the coastal areas where an invasion might occur. The real issue, however, wasn't actually about obtaining authorization from Hitler for the 21st Panzer Division's movements. As a tactical reserve under Rommel's direct authority, The division could have been ordered by Rommel himself to attack the invasion beaches. The true problem was the chaos that had descended upon the German command structure. Broken communication lines, contradictory intelligence reports flooding in from multiple sources, and most crucially, the absence of the division commander meant that nobody present at headquarters possessed the necessary authority to commit the entire division to a full-scale assault against the beach landings. The critical moment for launching an immediate strike at the vulnerable invasion beaches had already slipped away. Throughout the morning hours, the division's tanks had been engaged in combat with paratroopers in the inland areas, committed to fighting in the wrong direction, while the actual invasion force was landing on the coast just miles away. Every other panzer division in France was positioned between 50 and 100 miles inland from the coast. The 12th SS Panzer Division, composed of fanatical young Hitler youth volunteers, was stationed near Évreux, while Panzer Lehr, one of Germany's most elite armored formations, was positioned south of Chartres. The 2nd Panzer Division was located even farther from the action than the others. Unlike the 21st Panzer Division, however, these three divisions were classified as OKW reserves, meaning they were Hitler's personal strategic reserve forces. Without explicit authorization from the Führer himself, these divisions were completely immobilized. Not a single tank, not even a single half-track could be moved. As dawn broke over Normandy, incoming reports confirmed the massive scale of the Allied operation unfolding along the coast. The horizon was filled with Allied naval vessels as far as the eye could see. Thousands upon thousands of landing craft were approaching the beaches, spread across 5 distinct landing zones along the Normandy coast. Commanders of the 12th SS Panzer Division requested immediate authorization to begin moving their forces toward the invasion beaches. The response they received was identical to what others had been told throughout the early morning hours. The Führer was sleeping. His staff members refused to wake him under any circumstances, and all units would have to wait for proper authorization to be granted. The 21st Panzer Division remained paralyzed not by enemy action, but by the chaos within their own command structure and the continued absence of their commanding officer. The other panzer divisions scattered across France were equally paralyzed, but for a different reason. They were waiting for a telephone call to be made to Bavaria, where Hitler slept. For months leading up to the invasion, Hitler had engaged in heated arguments with his field marshals regarding the proper deployment and control of the Panzer Reserve forces. Rommel had advocated strongly for positioning them close to the coast, where they could immediately counterattack any invasion attempt, while Field Marshal von Rundstedt preferred keeping them farther inland, where they could respond to threats across a wider area. Both field marshals had presented their strategic arguments directly to Hitler, seeking his support for their respective positions. Hitler's solution to this strategic disagreement was to place the Panzer Reserves under his own personal control. No division would be permitted to move without receiving authorization directly from his headquarters in the Berghof. He alone would make the decision about when and where these critical armored forces would launch their counterattack against any Allied invasion. In practical terms, this command structure meant that every movement of every panzer division required a telephone call to be placed to the Berghof in Bavaria. It meant waiting for Hitler to be awakened, briefed on the situation, and given time to consider his options. It meant obtaining his personal approval before a single tank engine could be started. On the morning of June 6, 1944, this bureaucratic system meant that the German army's response to the largest amphibious invasion in the history of warfare depended entirely on whether anyone possessed the courage to wake Adolf Hitler from his sleep. Nobody did. By the time dawn had fully broken over the beaches, British troops were already wading ashore at Sword Beach under heavy fire. American forces were landing at both Utah Beach and the bloodbath that was Omaha Beach. Canadian troops were assaulting Juno Beach with determination. Meanwhile, 20 miles inland from this carnage, Feuchtinger's panzer forces sat idle in their assembly areas with cold engines and crews who could do nothing but wait for orders. Technically speaking, they were Rommel's tactical reserve forces and shouldn't have needed authorization from Hitler to move. However, Rommel himself was in Germany at that moment, visiting his wife for her birthday, completely unaware that the invasion had begun. Feuchtinger had been enjoying himself in Paris instead of being at his command post, and the officers at 7th Army headquarters were unwilling to authorize a major panzer attack without first checking with higher levels of the command chain. In the confusion and chaos of those early morning hours, everyone in the German command structure was paralyzed by fear of making decisions that might later be questioned. They sent requests for authorization up to OKW, the German High Command. OKW responded that Hitler needed to be properly briefed on the situation before any authorization could be granted. All the while, the panzer crews could hear the distant horizon screaming with the sounds of battle. The dull, rhythmic thunder of thousands of artillery shells impacting the coastal areas rolled across the countryside like a continuous storm. The sharp smell of diesel fuel hung heavy in the morning air around the stationary tanks. Tank crews stood around smoking cigarettes, listening helplessly as their comrades on the coast were being systematically destroyed by the massive Allied assault. They were ready to fight. Their machines were fueled, armed, and prepared for combat. But they remained trapped in a bureaucratic paralysis while the invasion they had been specifically positioned to stop grew stronger and more entrenched with each passing hour. The authorization to move had still not arrived from Hitler's headquarters. Within less than an hour after the first landing craft had touched down on the beaches, Division headquarters was receiving detailed reports from multiple observation posts scattered along the coast. The invasion wasn't concentrated on a single beach, as some had theorized it might be. Instead, Allied forces were hitting 5 separate beaches simultaneously across a 50-mile stretch of the Normandy coastline. Sword Beach, positioned directly north of Caen, was experiencing the heaviest assault in the 21st Panzer's sector. British commandos and regular infantry units were fighting their way off the sand and beginning to push inland against German defensive positions. The Allied troops were still vulnerable at this stage, still disorganized and establishing their foothold on French soil. This was the critical moment when armor could make a decisive difference in the battle. This was the window of opportunity when a concentrated panzer counterattack might actually succeed in driving the invaders back into the sea. Feuchtinger's operations officer had prepared a solid tactical plan for just such a situation. One battle group, consisting of tanks and supporting infantry, would drive north directly to Sword Beach. They would strike the British forces from the flank, while those forces were still in the vulnerable process of establishing their beachhead. The plan was tactically sound and had a reasonable chance of success, but implementing it required one thing that continued to elude them: authorization from higher command. 2 hours after the invasion had begun, British troops were no longer pinned down on the beaches. They were moving inland, expanding their positions and bringing up support weapons. By mid-morning, a full 3 hours had elapsed since the first landings commenced on the beaches. Feuchtinger's patience worn thin by the delays and the sounds of battle, had finally been exhausted. He placed a direct telephone call to 7th Army headquarters, bypassing some of the normal command protocols. He explained with barely controlled frustration that British forces were now only 12 miles from his current position. His division could engage them and launch a counterattack within the hour if he received the necessary authorization. 7th Army headquarters, recognizing the urgency, immediately called OB West, the Western Command. OB West then called OKW, the High Command. OKW's response was the same maddeningly bureaucratic answer. The Führer had not yet been briefed on the situation, and no authorization would be granted until he had personally reviewed the situation and made his decision. Adolf Hitler was still asleep in his bed in Bavaria. The fate of Western Europe, the outcome of the largest military operation ever attempted, hung precariously on whether anyone would dare open a bedroom door in the Berghof. High-ranking officers, men who commanded thousands of soldiers and hundreds of tanks, stood in hushed hallways, completely paralyzed by the breathing of one sleeping man. The Third Reich's rigid command structure, the Führerprinzip that demanded absolute obedience to Hitler's personal authority, was now strangling the regime's own ability to survive the crisis unfolding in Normandy. The German commanders were more terrified of waking Hitler and facing his potential anger than they were of losing the war that was being decided on the beaches of France. Feuchtinger's tank crews remained sitting in their positions, watching helplessly as Allied aircraft filled the skies above them. Hundreds of planes darkened the sky, perhaps thousands. It was difficult to count them all. The Luftwaffe, Germany's air force, was almost completely absent from the skies over Normandy, except for a single pair of fighter aircraft. 2 FW-190 fighters made a strafing run over Sword Beach that morning, attacking Allied positions briefly before disappearing. 2 aircraft attempting to contest thousands of Allied planes. It was a gesture of defiance and nothing more, having no practical military value. With each hour that passed without authorization, the planned counterattack became more difficult to execute successfully. Every hour provided the Allies with precious time to bring more troops ashore, more tanks rolling off landing craft, more artillery pieces being positioned, more supplies being stacked on the beaches. An hour later, new reports arrived at division headquarters with even more disturbing news. Allied forces had successfully captured the bridges spanning the Orne River. Those strategically vital bridges were located only 6 miles from Feuchtinger's headquarters. The British were advancing rapidly inland, expanding their beachhead with every passing minute. And still, the 21st Panzer Division sat motionless, waiting for a telephone call from Bavaria that refused to come. Feuchtinger wasn't the only German commander desperately requesting authorization to move his forces toward the invasion. The 12th SS Panzer Division had been attempting to receive movement orders since early morning when news of the invasion first reached them. This division represented some of Germany's most elite forces, fresh troops who hadn't been ground down by years of war, well equipped with modern weapons and vehicles, possessing 150 tanks, manned by young fanatics, recruited from the Hitler Youth, who had been indoctrinated to fight to the death for the Third Reich. However, unlike the 21st Panzer Division, which was theoretically under Rommel's tactical control, the 12th SS was classified as an OKW reserve, which meant they were tethered directly to the Führer's personal authority. The division commander wanted to begin driving immediately toward the invasion beaches. Every single staff officer At 7th Army Headquarters agreed with this assessment. Send the 12th SS Panzer Division now, while the invasion was still fresh and the Allied beachheads were vulnerable. The formal request was transmitted to OKW Headquarters. The response that came back was the same bureaucratic wall: wait for authorization, no movements, permitted without the Führer's approval. Panzer Lehr Division was also ready and eager to move toward the sound of the guns. They possessed 183 tanks and were considered to have the best-trained panzer troops in the entire German army. If they departed immediately, they could reach the Normandy battlefield by evening and launch a major counterattack. However, Panzer Lehr was also classified as an OKW reserve force, directly controlled by Hitler. Their urgent movement request was also denied by the cautious staff officers in Bavaria. The answer from the Berghof remained a terrifying, bureaucratic silence. By late morning, 5 full hours after the invasion had begun, 3 entire panzer divisions with a combined strength of 460 tanks were sitting completely motionless in various locations across France. All of them were waiting for authorization to move, all because Hitler's staff members refused to wake him from his sleep. Feuchtinger finally realized something absolutely terrible about his situation. Even if he somehow managed to receive authorization to launch an attack toward the beaches, his division would be attacking completely alone. The 12th SS Panzer Division wasn't coming to support him. Panzer Lehr Division wasn't coming either. His division would have to attempt to stop the entire Allied invasion by itself, without any support from other German armored forces. By the way, where are you watching this video from? Please write in the comments which country you're in. I'd love to know where our audience is located around the world. At noon, 6 hours after the first Allied soldier had waded ashore, reports confirmed what Feuchtinger had feared most. Allied forces had successfully established solid, defensible beachheads on all 5 landing zones along the Normandy coast. At Sword Beach, British forces had pushed 3 miles inland from the water's edge. At Juno Beach, Canadian troops had captured several French towns and were consolidating their positions. At Gold Beach, British forces had successfully linked up with American troops advancing from Omaha Beach, creating a continuous Allied front. The narrow window of opportunity for launching a devastating counterattack that might throw the invasion back into the sea was rapidly closing. During the first few hours of any amphibious invasion, the attacking troops are at their most vulnerable point. They're disorganized after the chaotic beach landing. They're struggling to establish reliable supply lines. They're working frantically to get armor and artillery off the beaches and into fighting positions. That early period is when a concentrated panzer attack has the greatest chance of succeeding. That's the moment when you can realistically push an invasion force back into the sea and defeat the landing. By noon on D-Day, that critical moment was rapidly passing into history. Allied forces had spent 6 precious hours strengthening their positions, digging in, bringing up reinforcements. They had artillery support operational now, providing covering fire for advancing troops. They had deployed anti-tank guns in defensive positions, ready to engage any German armor that appeared. Most significantly, they had established complete air superiority over the battlefield, which meant any German column attempting to move in daylight would be destroyed from the air. Feuchtinger, a professional soldier, did the tactical mathematics in his head. If authorization to attack came right at this moment, his tanks could reach the front lines in approximately 2 hours. That would mean launching the counterattack 8 hours after the invasion had begun. At that point, it might already be too late to achieve anything decisive. In early afternoon, 8 long hours after the invasion had commenced, authorization to move finally arrived at 21st Panzer Division headquarters. However, the authorization didn't come from Adolf Hitler or his headquarters in Bavaria. Local commanders at 7th Army headquarters had finally made a decision on their own authority. They couldn't wait any longer while the situation deteriorated by the hour. They authorized Feuchtinger to attack the invasion beaches on their own responsibility, bypassing the normal command chain. 8 hours had been wasted. 8 hours of precious time when the invasion force had been most vulnerable. 8 hours spent watching Allied forces strengthen their positions and bring reinforcements ashore. Feuchtinger immediately issued orders for his division to begin the attack he had been planning since dawn. Finally, after sitting idle all morning, his tank crews received the orders they had been desperately waiting for. They started their engines with a mixture of relief and anger at the delay. The tactical plan Feuchtinger implemented was straightforward and aggressive. His forces would drive north toward the coast, aiming to reach the area between Sword Beach and Juno Beach. If successful, they would cut the Allied beachheads in half, separating British forces from Canadian forces. This would cause panic in the Allied command, forcing them to divert forces from their advance to contain the German breakthrough instead. Within 30 minutes of receiving authorization, the lead elements of the 21st Panzer Division began moving northward toward the coast. This would be the only German armored counterattack launched on D-Day itself. The division had 12 miles of French countryside to cover before reaching the coast. They needed to reach the invasion beaches before Allied positions became too strong to break through. Allied reconnaissance aircraft spotted the German column immediately after it began moving. The 21st Panzer Division drove north through scattered British positions that had advanced inland from Sword Beach. German commanders made the tactical decision to bypass strong points rather than getting bogged down in protracted fights, pushing through areas where British resistance was lightest. The division was moving quickly, making good progress toward the coast, but the Allied resistance they encountered was considerably stronger than German intelligence had predicted. British anti-tank guns were already positioned to cover the likely German approach routes, and infantry positions were better organized than expected. The advance toward the coast proceeded more slowly than Feuchtinger's plan had called for. By 7 o'clock that evening, 9 hours into the battle, the lead elements of the German attack finally reached the village of Lyon-sur-Mer on the coast. They had made it. German tanks had reached the invasion beaches. Tank commanders opened their hatches and stood up to survey the scene before them. The air carried a strange smell, not the clean salt smell of the sea they had expected. Instead, it reeked of cordite from explosions and ozone from the massive concentration of military equipment. What they saw when they looked toward the beaches wasn't just a fleet of ships or an army coming ashore. They witnessed an industrial machine of war so vast in scale that it made their entire armored division look like children's toys in comparison. Thousands of ships stretched across the horizon as far as the eye could see. Landing craft continued bringing fresh troops ashore in an endless stream. Supply dumps covered entire sections of beach, growing larger by the hour. In that sobering moment, as the German tank commanders absorbed the overwhelming scale of what they were facing, the bravado and confidence of their counterattack simply evaporated into the smoky air. They weren't just fighting against an army or even a group of armies. They were fighting against the industrial might of nations, against the future itself. And their division was completely alone on this battlefield, without support, without reinforcements, without air cover. Despite the overwhelming odds, the battle group commander ordered the attack to continue as planned. German tanks pushed westward along the coast road, attempting to exploit the gap between Sword Beach and Juno Beach. If they could establish a strong position in that gap, they could threaten both beachheads simultaneously. They could force the British and Canadian commanders to pull back forces from their inland advance to deal with the German penetration of their rear areas. An hour later, after fighting through sporadic resistance, German tanks had successfully reached a position on the coastline between the two Allied beaches. They had actually done what seemed impossible. The 21st Panzer Division had reached the invasion beaches on D-Day itself. For approximately 30 minutes, German armor sat on high ground overlooking the coast and poured fire into Allied positions below them. They destroyed several supply dumps, sending ammunition and fuel up in spectacular explosions. They engaged British tanks that were moving inland from the beaches, destroying several in brief, violent exchanges of fire. This was the only German armored force that would manage to reach the invasion beaches on June 6th, and the achievement wouldn't last long. When authorization had finally come to attack, Feuchtinger had been promised significant support for his division. He had been told the 12th SS Panzer Division was moving and would arrive to support his attack. He had been told Panzer Lehr was coming to join the counterattack. He had been promised air support from the Luftwaffe to protect his advancing columns. By evening, as his lead elements fought on the coast, none of the promised support had materialized. The Luftwaffe didn't appear. Not a single German aircraft showed up to support the ground attack. Meanwhile, the skies above Normandy were filled with Allied fighters and fighter-bombers, hundreds of them circling like predatory birds. Any German vehicle that moved was immediately attacked from the air. There was a bitter joke that circulated among German troops in 1944 about aircraft identification. If the plane is camouflaged, it's British. If it's silver, it's American. And if it's invisible, it's the Luftwaffe. As the 21st Panzer Division sat exposed on the coast, that dark joke didn't seem funny anymore. It had become a death sentence for German soldiers. The 12th SS Panzer Division hadn't arrived to support the attack despite the promises. Feuchtinger's radio operators couldn't establish contact with them. Nobody in the German command structure seemed to know where they were or when they would reach the Normandy battlefield. Panzer Lehr Division wasn't coming either, still stuck somewhere inland waiting for additional authorization or dealing with their own movement problems. The battle group commander, positioned on the coast, sent an urgent radio message back to division headquarters. His forces had successfully reached the beaches and were engaging Allied troops, but they were completely alone and dangerously exposed to counterattack. They needed reinforcements immediately if they were going to hold this position. Feuchtinger had no reinforcements available to send to support his forward units. His entire division was already committed to the battle. Every tank, every infantry squad, every support unit was engaged. There was nothing held back in reserve, no fresh forces available to exploit the breakthrough or reinforce success. Allied naval guns suddenly opened fire on the German positions. Destroyers positioned offshore had spotted the German tanks on the high ground. Then massive 16-inch shells from Allied battleships began landing on and around the German positions with devastating accuracy. Tanks simply disappeared in enormous explosions. Half-tracks were blown apart, their crews killed instantly. Then around 9 o'clock that evening, something truly terrifying happened from the German perspective. 250 British gliders suddenly appeared in the sky, a vast armada of them. This was Operation Mallard, a massive reinforcement of British airborne forces. The gliders flew directly over the exposed German positions, heading inland to reinforce the paratroopers who had landed that morning. The German battle group commander, watching this aerial armada pass overhead, believed his force was being surrounded. He thought airborne forces were landing in his rear, cutting off his line of retreat. Combined with the naval guns firing from the front and the complete absence of promised reinforcements, he faced what appeared to be encirclement and annihilation. With his force in danger of being cut off and destroyed, he made the difficult decision that circumstances forced upon him. His battle group couldn't remain in their exposed position on the coast. They would be annihilated if they stayed. Within 30 minutes of making this decision, the 21st Panzer Division began withdrawing from the coastal positions they had fought so hard to reach. They had held their position on the invasion beaches for exactly 30 minutes. In late afternoon, 10 full hours after the invasion had begun that morning, Adolf Hitler finally authorized the Panzer Reserve Divisions to move toward Normandy. The 12th SS Panzer Division, the Hitler Youth Division, received formal orders to proceed toward the battlefield. They began their movement approximately 1 hour after receiving these orders. Allied aircraft found the division's columns on the roads within minutes of them starting to move. The march that should have taken 4 hours under normal conditions ended up taking 48 hours of stop-and-start movement under constant air attack. The division was attacked continuously from the air throughout their journey. Tanks burned on the roadsides. Supply trucks exploded, blocking the routes behind them. The roads became killing grounds, where German vehicles were destroyed one after another by Allied fighter bombers. When the young fanatics of the Hitler Youth Division finally reached the Normandy battlefield on June 8th, 2 full days after D-Day, they had lost 30% of their equipment to air attacks. The division arrived scattered, disorganized, and exhausted from the ordeal of simply trying to reach the battle. Panzer Lehr Division suffered even worse losses during their movement. Allied fighter bombers destroyed so many vehicles during their march toward Normandy that the division suffered devastating losses to their transport columns, which severely hampered their offensive power before they even reached the front lines to engage Allied ground forces. The 2nd Panzer Division faced delays caused by weeks of sabotage by French resistance fighters and continuous air attacks, finally arriving too late to effect the establishment of the Allied beachheads. They eventually reached the Normandy area around June 12th and fought in the Battle of Caen before being destroyed in the Falaise Pocket later that summer. By June 7th, the day after D-Day, the narrow window of opportunity for stopping the invasion had definitively closed. Allied forces had successfully brought 5 full divisions ashore in Normandy. Over 150,000 troops were now in France, and more were arriving every hour. The Allies had established beachheads that were so strong and so well supplied that they couldn't possibly be dislodged by any German counterattack. The concentrated panzer counterattack that Hitler had always envisioned, massed armored forces crushing the invasion and throwing it back into the sea, never happened as he had planned it. By the time he finally authorized the panzer divisions to move toward Normandy, it was already far too late for them to affect the outcome of the invasion. During those 8 critical hours of German paralysis and bureaucratic delay on the morning of D-Day, Allied forces had accomplished the seemingly impossible. They transformed 5 separate, vulnerable landing zones into connected, mutually supporting beachheads. They brought tanks and artillery ashore in large numbers, greatly strengthening their combat power. They established complete air superiority over the battlefield which made any German movement in daylight absolutely suicidal. The 21st Panzer Division's brief counterattack, despite its failure, had proven something strategically important about the battle. If German armored forces had managed to hit the beaches during the first critical hours when Allied forces were at their most vulnerable, disorganized, and still getting organized, the invasion might actually have been stopped, or at least thrown into chaos. One Panzer Division attacking alone couldn't accomplish this task. The 21st Panzer had proven that conclusively. However, 3 Panzer Divisions attacking together, the 21st, the 12th SS Hitler Youth, and Panzer Lehr, all attacking during the first 8 hours of the invasion, might have succeeded in defeating the landings, though even this possibility is heavily debated by historians. Allied air supremacy over Normandy was so complete and overwhelming that the 12th and 12th SS Hitler Youth and Panzer Lehr divisions might never have reached the coast, regardless of when Hitler had authorized them to move. The Allied fighter bombers prowling the skies would likely have found these divisions on the roads and systematically destroyed them before they could reach the battlefield, just as happened when they did finally move 2 days later. The 8-hour window of opportunity wasn't just about receiving authorization from Hitler's headquarters. It represented the only window of time when movement toward the beaches was even possible at all, before Allied air power made such movement a death sentence. Feuchtinger spent the remainder of June fighting an increasingly desperate and losing battle against overwhelming Allied superiority. His division was progressively ground down by relentless Allied air power and the sheer overwhelming numbers of Allied troops and equipment pouring ashore. By July, the 21st Panzer Division had effectively ceased to exist as an organized fighting force capable of offensive operations. The 8 hours of delay didn't just cost Germany the opportunity to contest the beachheads successfully. It cost an entire generation of young German men their lives in a futile struggle. The panzer crews who had sat idle that morning, listening to the sounds of battle while waiting for authorization, would spend the next 2 months of summer being hunted from the air, retreating through the ruins of French towns and villages in a country they could no longer hold or defend. Hitler's gamble on maintaining personal control of the panzer reserves hadn't just failed to achieve its objective. It had transformed Normandy into a massive graveyard for the very armored forces that had been meant to save the Third Reich from defeat. The elite Hitler Youth Division and Panzer Lehr Division suffered the same fate as the 21st Panzer. The German armored reserves that were supposed to have stopped D-Day and thrown the Allies back into the sea were instead destroyed piecemeal over the following weeks of fighting. They never received the chance to fight as Hitler had always intended, concentrated together in a massive, decisive counterattack that would crush the invasion. The Allied invasion succeeded beyond the planners' hopes. The beachheads not only held against German counterattacks but rapidly expanded. Within 3 months of D-Day, Allied forces had broken out of Normandy, destroyed German forces in the Falaise pocket, and liberated France from 4 years of occupation.